C'est bon? Donc on va commencer à 50.
Vous êtes prêts?
On est prêts.
Allez, c'est parti.
Bonjour, bienvenue à l'École nationale supérieure de création industrielle Les Ateliers à Paris. Vous allez assister à la soutenance aujourd'hui des Master of Science Nature Inspired Design. Le programme étant enseigné aussi en partie en anglais et nous allons avoir le privilège d'écouter la soutenance d'Amanda Lewis en anglais. Amanda, donc 1 heure de présentation. 35 à 40 minutes de présentation, 20 minutes de questions avec le jury. Et c'est donc à toi la parole. Voilà, merci. Bienvenue à tous.
Thank you, Geneviève. Good morning and welcome, everyone. Thanks for joining us this morning, everyone who's here and everyone who's online too. My name's Amanda Lewis, and I'm originally from the US, so I'm going to be presenting in English this morning. And to start off, I'm going to share a little bit about who I am and what my practice was like before coming to ENSCI. So I consider myself an artist and a designer and a creative, kind of blending all of these creative practices together, working at the intersection of environments and digital technologies. And the reason I speak about that is because my bachelor's degree before coming to ENSCI was in art media and technology at Parsons Paris. And so during this program, it gave me a lot of technical skills, and including prototyping, electronics, coding. We developed a lot of artistic installations and from start to finish, essentially. And during this program, what I learned was the most conceptual kind of takeaway I got was how to approach technological tools with a critical perspective. And so just to share kind of briefly with you what my diploma project was for this. Essentially, I built a pollution sensing device, which I used to kind of investigate these natural spaces. And then within this investigation, I collected lots of data over a long period of time and sonified it into a digital soundscape of what the pollution for each of these spaces, what the pollution levels were. And in the final exhibition for this project, I exhibited my first written memoir and all the prototypes that happened during this research. And so after graduating, what my bachelor's degree kind of brought me was the launch of my creative practice. And so in my creative practice, I am constantly exploring the boundaries between the human, the technological, and the natural. And so a couple of projects that I did between my undergraduate degree and coming to ENSCI. First one is Telenature Lab, which I completed during a residence in the south in Aix-en-Provence. Essentially, we collaborated with a design school in Aix-en-Provence to bring sounds of nature live streamed into exhibition spaces. And so we prototyped these kinds of devices and installations that were capable of transmitting sounds that were recorded live from research stations all over the world in order for people in cities who aren't exactly sensibilized to the real sounds of remote nature. It's called Radio Rocher, real-time streaming into exhibition spaces. The first prototype was more of a design object, and then we moved further towards an artistic installation which took the form of a stone that was emitting sound in the middle of the space. Another project that I completed was called Ola Biodiv. It's also with the Hive residency. However, this one was in partnership with the Caisse des Dépôts biodiversity subsidiary. And so during this project, we created a series of workshops and ateliers for sensibilizing citizens towards biodiversity issues in their kind of local environment. We wanted to show everyone the level of biodiversity that exists in their city. So we developed a few workshops, very hands-on, and the goal was to use this within the local government to implement this workshop. And so why ENSCI and why biomimicry? because my practice is about these intersections between human nature, technology, I have a degree already kind of exploring the human and technology aspect, and I wanted to kind of nourish that with a mastery of what it means to be inspired by nature in creative practices. I also wanted to continue to build a network of people who are also interested in this and also developing projects around these ideas. So, going into my professional mission, as I come from an art background, I wanted to test out what it means to apply biomimetic concepts into artistic contexts. So, before coming to ENSCI, I started working at Gallery D, which is the gallery for Parsons Paris, and I essentially do all of the production, curation, and programming and installation for the gallery. And so during my time working for the gallery, I kind of noticed we have a problem with material usage in the space. And so I wanted to ask the question of how we can use these notions found in biomimicry to reduce material waste in the gallery, to facilitate also pedagogical practices, as this is a gallery that serves an art school and we're teaching students how to add value to their work through the space, and also inform the artistic practices that come through. So I started by kind of mapping out different life cycles of the scenography that already exist in the gallery. Currently it's a kind of linear state. Scenography is either dismantled and thrown away, or it's stored in the space, but it's not exactly optimized for the space that we have. Essentially all of our scenography comes from past exhibitions that are in different artistic institutions, but they're not necessarily built for the gallery. And so we do have a surplus of furniture that's built from materials that isn't ideal for our space. And so I kind of reflected on what it would mean to create a circular loop inside or for scenography, basically allowing students to reflect and design their projects based around the scenography that we have. I kind of stumbled upon, when I was looking into this, the concept of ecoscenography. It's a concept created by Tanya Beer, who has been researching green scenography practices for her work. And so she is talking about scenography as a way of awareness when you're creating a project in a space, to think about the object not as just a support for an artistic practice, but also as an object itself with its own social, environmental, economic, political consequences. So reflecting on all of these, I tried to design some new installation principles to be used in the gallery, talking about upcycling and repurposing materials, collaborative consumption. The gallery exists in a space that is shared with, or we are part of a art foundation that is shared with a lot of galleries. We have a lot of scenography, a lot of exhibitions are coming through. So why can't we share furniture, materials, all of this stuff, and collaborate more together? Designing for durability and reuse. Designing scenography that can be moved around by students, always a bit of an issue. Also thinking about the materials that we're using when creating this furniture. And then recycling and waste reduction. All of these principles, you know, apply into the circularity, but they're also kind of more economically viable for the space as well. Another part of working in the gallery was having the chance to kind of plunge into curating an exhibition with a colleague of mine. The exhibition that we curated was called How Did We Get Here? And so the concept was to kind of explore the relationship between our bodies, nature, cultures, and the technologies that we're influencing. And so during this exhibition, I attempted to kind of implement all of these installation practices that I had initially outlined. One of the interesting projects is Chris Madden here, who is exhibiting a project where she turned flower pots of plants into a phone. And so the plants are actually an interface for a kind of technology. And so during this exhibition, I had the chance to exhibit a project that I also worked on during my mission at the Low Carbon Design Institute, which was a 1-month virtual residency based out of London. I did the residency with 2 other artists who were also interested in kind of the intersections between art, ecology, talking about climate change in these creative spaces. And so the project that I created for this residency is called Breathing in Disaster. And so it was a meditation that I wrote in order to kind of think of the atmosphere as a space of exchange of history between human bodies, other life forms, biology, the earth itself, if we think of volcanoes as a breathing tool for the earth, and also industry. Think about the respiration of cars, of factories. And so during this, I wanted to kind of question as well the place of these natural phenomena and kind of non-biological entities in biomimicry as well. You know, the atmosphere may not, it plays a role in biomimicry and how we all exchange between humans, between life forms. It's a space of collaboration between all of us. So my kind of key takeaways from my professional mission were these new possibilities that I came across. You know, through my mission, I was thinking about all of the ways that we could apply biomimetic practices to art and art production, continuing my work in the gallery afterwards to kind of apply these practices more in detail, and also to collaborate more with colleagues. Within the context of this mission, I was able to use the tools that I gained at ENSCI to launch a discussion with a lot of colleagues of mine who were not kind of privy to this approach before, and also to create kind of a network of colleagues who are interested and are motivated to address these subjects within my workspace. Another aspect that I wanted to touch on was exhibition design. So one potential application we talk about is in the actual design of the exhibition itself, and it's something that I've started thinking about for a potential future project for my memoir, which we'll get to a little bit later. And now, going into the partnership project, I was part of the group that worked with the CNES and the kind of space center in France, and together we worked over the course of 6 months with Sylvain Michel from the CNES and to investigate the issue of saturation in orbit around Earth. So what is orbital saturation? Essentially, we have too many satellites, too much debris clogging up the orbits around our Earth. It's incredibly important to keep these orbits clean, to keep them accessible, because we send satellites that are in charge of a huge amount of our telecommunications, military, scientific research, and we use this space. And so if we don't take into account now how to manage this space, we start to have something called the Kessler effect, which is an exponential increase in space debris by everything slowly kind of hitting together, creating more debris, increased collisions over time. And so one of the issues of this is that there's a lack of cohesive governance and accountability and orbital maintenance. It's a common space. It's shared between all these countries, the entire world, and so it's hard to hold all of the relevant actors accountable for their actions in orbit. Satellites themselves also pose an issue because they're designed to be cradle to grave. It's a linear approach to design. Essentially, the satellites are either burned in orbit on descent at the end of their life cycle, or they're sent out into space. We don't currently have a lot of good ways to reuse the materials that we have put into the construction of satellites. And then there's also this issue of new space, which is the lack of collaboration between space actors in not having a redundancy in the kinds of satellites that we're launching and why we're launching them in the first place. So looking at all of these issues, we explored a lot of different directions, first of all. And the question that kind of drove us to our solution was how we can propose a sustainable management of orbital resources through shared governance. And to do this, our proposition is called NOVA, Network for Organized Voting and Autonomy. Essentially, it's a network, a decentralized governance based on blockchain that allows for the collaboration of and sharing of space resources. Essentially, it would put all of the actors together in space, both private and public, because the current laws talking about orbital maintenance really only applied to governance. And now with SpaceX, Blue Horizon, all of these other companies, private actors are having a highly increased presence in space. We base this on principles for managing the commons, which essentially, looks at a common space and tries to decide who is responsible for all of managing the resources that come from it. We had a lot of different bio-inspirations. A lot of the inspirations that we looked at came from collaboration and competition as well. We looked at different kinds of relationships between species and what this means in when designing a new kind of decentralized governance. The kind of takeaways that I got from working on this project, it was very challenging. It's a huge systemic approach. We looked at the problem from a lot of different points of entry, a lot of different angles, and so finally we addressed it from a larger scale. However, the scale itself is highly complex and can take a lifetime, as we've seen with Sylvain Michel, to actually properly address all of the issues that are facing the question of orbital saturation. Also, a challenge was applying biomimicry in a non-ecological setting. There's no life in space. How do we apply biomimicry in a setting where we're only looking at technology, we're only looking at these kind of anthropocentric interactions? And so one of the I'm going to mention this because it's an interesting direction that didn't quite follow the brief of the project, but we spoke a lot about bioinspired blockchains, as our proposition was based on a blockchain for this idea of a decentralized governance. We started putting into question what it means to have a bioinspired blockchain, and it's an interesting research path for the future, I think. And yes, biomimicry in a purely technological setting was definitely a challenge to work with. However, it's something that interests me quite a lot as I start talking about my memoir. My memoir is called Doom on Mushrooms, and talking about the initial approach, because I come from an art background, this research takes more of the form of an artistic research. I want to take a time for a second and put into value what it means to have or to use artistic research in this setting. This is a quote from Jeffrey Bacher, who is a professor of informatics with disnovation.org, who's an artist duo that I've worked with previously in the past. Essentially, he's saying in this quote that we need storytellers, we need artists in order to help understand the world around us, by telling these stories, by rethinking these stories, by sharing not just the pragmatic effects of what we're doing, but also kind of the heart of what is happening as well. So in my own research, I'm questioning the ideological, conceptual, and this kind of conceptual approach, and reflecting and pushing on the boundaries of the subject matter in order to kind of further understand the subject matter, which I'm about to present. So my memoir consists of a curious collection of metaphors, speculations, and comparisons between the organic and the digital. So my point of departure, Doom. So the year is 2025, and someone has Doom running on mushrooms. This was a response on Reddit that I found in relationship to the work of Professor Andrew Adamadsky. Essentially, in my own research, I look a lot at digital culture and the interactions that are happening online as part of my research. And so I found this Reddit reply incredibly funny and decided to go further into the research that was that it was responding to, which is research into fungal computing. So Towards Fungal Computation is a paper written by Professor Andrew Adamadsky. Essentially, he's trying to design computing algorithms based on fungi, not just in their form, but also in their function. So this is a kind of test that he's done here of the testing electrical signals and logic gateways within mycelial presence on stick here. And so he's looking at not just kind of questioning the form of computation, but also questioning how we compute in the first place. Like, imagine a computer that's essentially built on mushrooms. The reason I put Doom into this question, and the reason I think this other Reddit user did as well, was because Doom runs on everything. And so it was released in 1993 by ID Software, but the interesting thing about Doom is that it runs on, yes, everything. It was initially developed to run on a lot of different platforms due to the technological constraints of the era. It wasn't as homogenized between Apple and Microsoft as it is now. There were tons of different companies producing technology, and so they wanted to essentially have it be as accessible as possible. And so to do that, they did something a little bit crazy in 1997. They released the code of the game to the public. And so nowadays, we have a blog for Doom hackers, essentially people who are trying to run the game Doom on basically any device, and it's called It Runs Doom. It's been run on really old cell phones, exercise machines, smart fridges, all different kinds of technology. So if we live in a world where Doom can supposedly run on everything, could we imagine it running on mushrooms? And what other ways are the organic and the digital realms potentially linked? So I wanted to look at this idea of Doom on mushrooms as a metaphor. This idea kind of starts to blend the boundaries between the digital and the organic. It symbolizes a concept where nature and technology cease to be separate entities. They start combining into one biocomputational form. And so this metaphor also kind of allows us to question the convergence of what these two entities, the organic and the digital. So looking at the organic and the digital, I started off looking at Janine Benyus and what she has to say about technology and biomimicry. She thinks that, or I guess in her paragraph here, she's talking about formally what it means to have computing come from nature, bioinspired algorithms, looking at still silicon-based computation, but designing the form of it from bioinspiration. However, I kind of want to think about how not just the form, but also the heart of the thing itself. So our 21st century technology runs on silicon. So what can we think about in order to have envision an internet, envision a new kind of progression of technology that is based on nature's principles? Can we imagine a kind of digital space that is not just thinking about the negative impact on the climate, but just tries to eliminate it? Can we think about how the word organic plays into technology? And so to start off, I dove into the definitions of the organic and the digital. So the meaning of organic came from, or that we think of as relating to life forms, came from 1778. And in 1942, we started talking about pesticides. Essentially, there's a long history of using this word organic to relate to life forms because it comes from our organs itself. So looking at the word digital, the etymology is a little bit more interesting because the word digital actually started as a reference to your fingers. Your fingers are your digits, and so initially it was between numbers 0 and 10. However, when in 1938, I believe, yes, we started limiting this word more between 0 and 10 in order to refer to it as the way of processing data between zeros and ones. So the definition got tighter over time. So I want to not just look at how we compute or what we compute, but also why we compute. What are these tensions? What are these connections between organic and the digital? So naturally, I started with metaphors because even this research practice is still quite in its early stages. It's not a working prototype yet. So I wanted to reflect on what it would mean, what the impact of this would be. So I started looking at all the terminology and vocabulary as a metaphor. I was super interested by this idea that the word digital actually comes from fingers and at some point became applied to technology. And so I came across a book called Technobiophilia by Sue Thomas, and she basically thinks of this notion of applying natural concepts into technology as her definition of the word is technobiophilia, and she thinks it's because we love nature and that we want to represent it, we want to recreate it, we want to push it everywhere into technology because we want to recreate our own little world, I guess. I think it's a little bit more complicated than that, a little bit more nuanced, but I'll dive into this a little bit more. One of my favorite poems, also talking about metaphors and starting to dissect what this relationship between nature and technology is called All Watched Over by Machines of Loving Grace. It was written in 1967 by Richard Brautigan, and essentially this poem talks about either a dystopian or utopian future, depending on how you look at it, of these overwatching gods that are machines, which allow us to kind of return to our natural state as part of nature, frolicking in meadows. He paints an incredibly bucolic image of how we could re-enter into the natural realm thanks to our machines of loving grace who are watching over us. However, I think it's interesting to kind of look at this poem from two perspectives. It's illustrating a possible fictional future. Is this future utopian? Because as lovely, it would be incredibly lovely to be able to let go of a lot of the complexities that we have in everyday life now and return to this beautiful meadow that he's illustrating in the poem. However, it's also dystopian in the sense that do we really want to leave the control and the decisions for humanity and for our future up to these kinds of machines? They may be machines of loving grace, but the definition of loving grace is no longer defined by us at that point. I think looking at these kinds of things with the dual perspective played a huge part in how I approached my research. And so in my research, I looked a lot at terminology. Essentially, there's a huge lexicon of vocabulary that we can use to apply to both nature and technology. And I'm going to go into one example of that today, taking one little word and fleshing it out as much as possible to explore all of the relationships, all of the concepts that I could possibly get. And that word is mouse. So when we think of mice, for the people in this audience, we're all in Paris together. We think of mice as little creatures running in the metro. They're dirty, they bring disease. They're not my favorite, clearly. But they also have another kind of function. They are what's called an R-selected species, which is a species that reproduces very, very quickly in order to deal with the challenges in environment. And so within this, this is a conversation between two artists who are working a lot around the concepts of nature and talking about biodiversity and their practices. And so Marc Dion is talking about here how we're afraid of these species that are reproducing so much, rodents, weeds, all of this, because it kind of talks about the theme of extinction. We lose control. It's these species are showing us that actually the environments are less suited for more individual species, and so only ones that can combat them with overwhelming numbers are left. Alexis Rockman's response to Marc Dion when having this conversation about R-selected species, and I took this out because he's talking about mice as well. All of these species, all of these R-selected species come from they're more prevalent in spaces where we're talking about dominating nature. When Europeans brought over agricultural animals, pig, cattle, that outcompeted all of the indigenous species, all of these other kind of smaller rats, other rodents, bugs, weeds joined them. it's a symptom of our attempt to control nature through, for anthropocentric purposes, which I think is really interesting when we talk about this idea of control, because a mouse, as you may also know, is a tool. It was developed initially by Douglas Engelbart in the 1960s. So formally, the name mouse kind of reflects on the device's small size. It fits in your hand. It has a long tail that connects to your computer, or it did at some point before Bluetooth. And the way that we behave when we're using a mouse reflects this kind of skittery moving around a surface. The name mouse started becoming more popular in the 80s, after, even though that it was coined in the 60s as personal computing became more and more popular. So yes, we have two definitions for the word mouse. It's a small rodent, or it's also a handheld device. And so I think looking at this in a kind of dual capacity is really interesting when talking about the concept of control. A mouse is a small rodent that has the population that's difficult to control because it is an R-selected species and because it combats extinction through numbers. The mouse is also a tool for control that we use to access our personal devices. And so essentially in my research, I explored a lot of different terminologies like this. I'm not going to go super into detail of all of them for you today, but I wanted to touch on a few of them. Like the word bug. On one hand, it's a small insect. It's also a word for a small microphone that is used to pick up and survey individuals through spy and everything. Or it's also an error.
Sorry. Oh no. Outside. That happens every time. Okay?
So there was still 5 minutes remaining for Amanda. So once we're back on live. Hi, how are you doing? Nice to see you there. On est reparti? Tu voulais du sport hier. Bonjour à tous. Bon, désolé, nous avons une alerte incendie. Désolé Amanda. Donc il te reste encore 5 minutes pour finir ton exposé. Donc je te donne la parole. Merci à tous.
Thanks, Geneviève. And thanks everyone online who's waiting. So where was I? Talking about a few different terminologies that were also present in my research, but I'm not going to go into as deep into their concepts. But the bug, for example, small insect, a little microphone that is used as a surveillance device, or an error in a computing program. Cloud. It's a visible mass, excuse me, a visible mass of particles of condensed vapor, part of our atmosphere, part of this exchange. It's also a term that's used to talk about something that obscures or blemishes. To make something unclear or certain is to be cloudy. To be confused is to be cloudy. To make less transparent is to be cloudy. However, this word also talks about the computers and connections that compose cloud computation. There's something interesting about this idea of hiding, of making less transparent when talking about the infrastructure of cloud computing and why it's called this. The web as well. One, it's a network of threads constructed by spiders from a fluid that it creates. It's a complex system of interconnected elements, which I suppose would be inspired formally from the webs that are created by spiders. It's also the name for the internet, the World Wide Web, la toile d'araignée mondiale in French, which means the global spider web, or material that's downloaded from the web. It's also the membrane between, webbed feet, the membrane between toes. So, final thoughts when talking about my research and my memoir. This opportunity kind of allowed me to really go in and explore all of these different kinds of connections, starting from the terminology and breaking them down into larger concepts, exploring what it means for the organic and the digital to be related in this sense, just judging by how we name something. Nature can be our inspiration for the development of technologies, just how technology is a lens for us to view nature as well. And so it was great to be able to look at how we understand both the technological and the organic worlds from a similar lens. So final thoughts, next potential steps for my research. I think I could write forever about the subject. It's enormous and incredibly interesting to me. A lot of pathways were opened during the research process. It also opens the possibility for digital or plastic artistic practices that I'm interested in exploring. I talked about this a lot with Davide, who was my memoir director, about a couple of different examples. One of them comes from Mark Dion, who was aforementioned in one of the quotes that I spoke about, who's working around this idea of the curiosity cabinet as a way of telling a story that, through an artwork that combines histories from the natural, scientific, from design, all into one kind of context. And so considering this vocabulary embodies so many different ideas, we had a lot of discussions about using this format of a curiosity cabinet in order to potentially produce an installation based on this research. And so this didn't make it into the memoir because he responded a little late. I did try to contact Professor Adamansky, didn't respond, but I did finally get a tweet back from him. Although this was my point of departure, we still have to think more about Doom on mushrooms and what that means to use these specialized organic computing technologies. He said, probably no Doom on mushrooms. And to wrap up everything, my key kind of takeaways from this program, using design methodologies, I think, nourished my artistic practice. The way of questioning, the approach between ideation, prototyping, maquettage, allowed me to kind of reflect on my own practice and how I produce my work, and also through research methodologies. I was able to contextualize and continue to use inspiration from nature in both design and artistic research at a higher level now that I've spent a year and a half working on it, and thinking about the methodologies that we use in biomimetic practices, how to apply them both in art and in production of art. So, what's next for me? I'm going to continue working in Gallery D, continue working on applying these practices that I've kind of developed during the course of this master's. And I'm trying to use my memoir as a point of departure for continued research in other contexts as well. Hopefully in a kind of or one route I'm looking at as well is the doctoral route in recherche and création, or looking into kind of residencies or institutions who are willing to fund the research to continue so I can actually build a project around what I've done so far. So, thank you.
Thank you, Amanda. So we'll start the question session. You want to start? Okay, good.
Thank you, Amanda, for your presentation. So I have a few questions for you. And the first one is, so you presented us an exploration, but how do you connect it to scientific research? For example, so did you identify scientific articles, papers about this transfer of words from nature to technology?
Not scientifically in terms of terminology, but the book Technobiophilia talks about this a lot. I looked also, the most scientific article that I looked at was from Andrew Adamadsky and his research on fungal computing. I read a few other articles by him as well because he's not just looking at fungi, he's also looking at the blob and how using nature as different tools for creating computational functions. All of those were kind of things that didn't make it into the final research paper, but they were directions of research that I conducted.
Okay, but my question was, did you explore only the theme of art and science research, or did you also explore other kind of disciplines such as semantics and so on?
In this context, just art and science. However, it's something that I could continue to do as well.
Okay, I think would be really, really interesting. I have other questions, maybe another one. Because here we teach biomimicry, which is related to sustainability issues, and how could you connect your work about nature, technology, and maybe sustainability?
So one thing that interested me in the idea of organic computation is that this idea of if we can make a computer out of mycelium, it can be compostable. The technology that we use requires an enormous amount of materials, shipping, infrastructure to mine these silicon materials from the earth. I mean, I see loads of metal laptops in front of me right now, including the one that is here I'm presenting from. And so when I saw that Reddit response, thinking about running a video game on mushrooms, I thought, what if technology can become compostable? And so talking about sustainability, if we could reimagine a technological or an industry of technology that was based on compost, based on biology, rather than based on raw materials that can't be composted. Yeah, it was something that really sparked me.
Okay, great, because there's also the systemic scale that could be really interesting to explore also, and all the fields related to digital ecology that you could connect to your exploration. Definitely. Okay, thank you.
Maybe yes, we can do it in order. Thank you, Amanda. I had a question. So you say you would like to pursue this research. what would be for you? You already answered a little bit, but what would be for you your own metaphor? What would you work on? Because here is a state of the art of things that already exists. Or what would be your really enthusiastic pathway? What would you do?
In terms of developing a project, or just in the research?
In terms of
itself?
developing a project, if you had to pursue that work.
I mean, two kind of things I thought about. Even though Professor Adamatsky said that potentially Doom couldn't run on mushrooms, I think the idea of exploring what we could do with organic computation in an artistic context could be extremely interesting. It's collaborating between art and science is something that I was able to test a little bit during the master's, and something that I would like to go forward and pursue more collaborations between art and science. And so questioning what we're able to do with logic functions that come from mushrooms or the blob versus through metal or silicon-based computation is something that inspires me quite a lot. But also putting all of these things in a context together. I mean, I did talk about the Curiosity Cabinet as a format of a potential project that could come out of this. It was one direction that kind of allows us to look at all of these ideas in one setting. It allows us to tell a story, to curate around different fields, whereas normally the art, science, history is now divided into separate museums. But the Curiosity Cabinet is based on an older way of curating museums, which is to combine everything together into one story. And so that was something I'm also interested in exploring for this research.
Okay, thank you. And just a small remark, but if we're talking, yes, you talked about nature, but if we talk about biomimicry, cloud is not part of the biological world. So it's nature, and it's just a physical state of water. So it's not exactly, to me, in the same baskets and the other metaphors that you've used in the end.
Sure, but I think that it's important to talk about these processes that are incredibly intertwined with biology as well. Even though it's not technically le vivant, a life form in and of itself, it's something that is part of a larger model that we're looking at when looking at life forms.
Okay, we can debate about this.
Okay, on your fungal project, did you measure something? Or did you think about how to measure something in interaction to computer and fungi?
Do you mean in terms of like practically measuring through?
Yeah. In order to produce data and to use data in your...
Yeah, it's what Professor Adamatsky is doing. I don't have the scientific competences to be able to do this, which is why I think that collaborating between artists and scientists would be a really interesting direction to pursue. Yeah. But yeah.
Okay.
You have this three bubbles graphics at the beginning with human, nature, and technology. Where are you now? And do you think this graphic is still the state of the art of your thinking, or all this work has changed something, or where are you now?
I would say where I started in the master's, I think now I'm more centralized. I mean, all of this research that I've done is between two concepts that are natural and technological, but there's a context placed on it by humans and our understanding of the thing. And so I think that kind of brought my positioning more towards the center of this kind of Venn diagram that I've designed. I think before I would have been more on the human technological side, because I addressed the issues of looking at nature through artistic practices, but I think not as in-depth and not as conceptually as I've been able to do in my research here.
And you still make a difference between human and nature?
I guess when I say human, that's also a good subject for debate. For me, I guess the human would be the cultural, the constructed, versus the wild and unconstructed. But definitely a subject up for debate.
Yeah, it's a subject, and it's really interesting because it's also a cultural question because I think we do not have across the Atlantic the same views on this question, and it's why it's also really interesting that you came to Paris to make this program and to share your thoughts, and because it's clearly we do not have the same construction on this, and it's really important that we can debate and we can maybe share knowledge and views and thoughts. So that's why I asked the question, but it's something that we have to dig a little bit if you want to pursue on a doctorate or etc. Because it's a really important question, and maybe you will have to make it with two different cultural approaches, one from the European point of view and one from the American point of view, and it could be also interesting to see the differences and why it's so interesting.
Thank you.
Any other questions? Yeah.
Maybe a last one for me. So you were talking about a potential PhD. So did you start writing a research question, for example, you'd like to dig into?
Not yet. Not yet. That's something I've been looking at pre-doctorate programs, like Altec, for Paris 8, I think. But still been focusing on wrapping up here first before plunging into that.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you very much. Geneviève, the instructions?
I would like to have your feedback about your internship.
Yeah, in my internship, I think I was able to, or I guess my professional mission, combine a lot of different, whereas in my memoir I was able to talk about the conceptual applications of biomimicry, in my mission it was more of the practical and pragmatic applications of biomimicry into a artistic setting, both in the production of it and also in the curatorial process. I mean, what I was able to do in this master's is kind of have a context and a sense of legitimacy to be able to approach my colleagues with this subject and to kind of take action and make this happen. So, and to make the projects that I mentioned previously happen. So, yeah, it gave me a sense of possibility, I suppose.
Since you had a background dealing with design already, I was wondering what would be for you the main benefit you got from the master today?
The main benefit, that's a big question. The main benefit, I mean, for me, the project that I felt nourished me and my way of thinking the most was the research that I did for the memoir. And so having a context and an opportunity to kind of delve into this was super interesting. And what else? Yeah?
Okay, thank you. Well, no more questions? Okay, thank you very much, Amanda.
Thank you.
We will ask you to go and wait in the room. Donc, tout le monde dans le couloir, s'il vous plaît. Voilà, on va délibérer. Merci beaucoup.
Est-ce que j'enlève le micro? Geneviève.